So, while people are filling their cups with coffee, um, I would like to say good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to this second seminar in our seminar series about NATO. I am Nina Greger, I'm Senior Research Fellow here at NUPI, and I will also be chairing this afternoon session. And the seminar, I should say, is organized in cooperation with and also funded by the Norwegian Ministry of Defense and the NATO Public Diplomacy Division, and we should like to extend our thanks to both of these institutions, of course, for making this happen. So, the topic of today's seminar is, of course, the upcoming Warsaw Summit in July. And there are a number of questions that we would like the panelists to dwell on, and also the audience, of course. So what are the expectations for the Warsaw Summit? Has NATO followed up on its decisions of the former summit in Wales in the right way? This is a very important and challenging time for NATO, I think we could agree on. NATO and Europe are facing more complex security threats and environments. There are threats from the south, especially from ISIL, and from the east, where a more forward-leaning and also aggressive Russian foreign policy and different security narrative, maybe even self-image, is a great challenge to the alliance. And the horrible terrorist attacks against the heart of Europe in Brussels recently is also one example of how vulnerable our societies are. And NATO need also to think about these things. And also, what are the most effective responses not only to terrorism, but to all other types of challenges, such as hybrid warfare, cyber threats, grey zone or ambiguous threats? And of course, can the alliance at all afford to address all of these? And finally then, is NATO going to uphold its Article 5 obligations? And this is also a question that is often popped up, is the Baltic states at all defendable? And finally, how is NATO's relationship with other organizations like the EU, for instance, useful in meeting these threats and challenges? And maybe last but not least, how important will NATO be for the next US president? So to address and reflect upon at least some of these questions and to touch base with the scholarly debates outside of Norway, we invited three distinguished speakers. We have Christopher Coker here, Professor of International Relations and Head of Department at the LSE in London. We have Jeffrey Larson, Head of the Research Division at the NATO Defense College in Rome. And we have Henrik Breitenbach, Director at the Center for Military Studies at the University of Copenhagen. So our first speaker will be Professor Christopher Coker. He's professor, like I said, at the LSE in International Relations. He's also adjunct professor here at Norwegian Staff College and a regular lecturer at the Royal College of Defence Studies in London, NATO Defence College in Rome, the Center for International Security, and the National Institute for Defence Studies in Tokyo. And Professor Coker was a NATO fellow in 1981 and also served 2 terms on the Council of the Royal United Service Institute. He's a serving member of the board in a number of seminars, academies, institutions, etc., in Europe and in the US. And of course, not to mention having published extensively on topics such as war and risk, war and ethics, imagining a third world war even. He has also published on humane warfare and war without warriors. So we think he's really well placed to address today's topics. So please join me in welcoming Christopher Coker. I'll give you 50.
Thank you very much. Well, after such, is this actually on or not? Am I wired in or not? Okay, I'll just put it here. Thank you for that generous introduction. So I can't wait to hear what I have to say next. I should say I'm no longer head of department. If I had been head of department still, I would be 6 feet under. It's a pretty tedious job. Let me share in the 15 minutes that I've been allocated some ideas. I was at a NATO defense planners meeting in Oberammergau in February, where they were discussing the prospect of a new strategic concept for Warsaw, which I don't think is going to happen. But they asked me to come along and to say a few words about how to think, not what to think, about what should be in that strategic concept. So I thought I would share some ideas with you. NATO had enormous success at reinventing itself at the end of the Cold War after 1991, going into the risk management business. It's having some difficulties reinventing itself again, rebranding itself to meet a very different strategic environment from the one that was there back in 1991. And of course, there is a perception that NATO has lost its way in recent years, and that the Russians, for example, do strategy better than we do. I think that's a questionable conclusion to reach, but it is a very popular one in the press. So 7 points very quickly. I may not have time for all 7. How to think about the future. I think the important thing is, first of all, resilience. It's to always prepare for the unexpected. Hybrid warfare is, of course, top of the list of the unexpected, but I would just remind you that hybrid warfare was there in NATO planning back as early as the 1950s. It was there for the massive retaliation strategic concept. It was there for flexible response. It was there when the Allied mobile brigade was put together to deal precisely with the threat that the Russians might seize some territory in Denmark or Norway in the early 60s and try to trade that for West Berlin, for example. So hybrid warfare is not new. It's actually been in NATO thinking since 1957, but it has been absent from NATO thinking in the last 20 years. That's the problem, that NATO, in a sense, wasn't resilient enough to deal with the changing strategic environment. What is resilience? Resilience, I think, in an engineering sense, is the ability of a structure to maintain its core purpose when challenged. For example, a bridge in a major storm. What is the core purpose of NATO? Deterrence is the core purpose of NATO, and I think that will be the chief discussion point, how to beef up deterrence against Russia, because Russia is a country that needs to be deterred from acting against its own interests, let alone the interests of the rest of us, and containment of ISIS. And what that actually involves in terms of resources. Power is the second point. I think it's very important to put on the table. Lawrence Friedman, in his book, Strategy, a History, a massive work based on 40 years of contemplation, has a one-liner for strategy. Strategy is about the application of power. And I think we've lost sight of that. Power in the Cold War to deter the Soviet Union by imposing penalty costs, very severe penalty costs, and the power to reward good behavior. That was détente, that was trade, that was a more constructive relationship with Russia. We've somehow, I think, because we've been blinded by soft power, forgotten that hard power is still the name of the game for this alliance. And you shouldn't establish red lines in the sand. And you shouldn't go for blue sky objectives like the removal of Assad from power in Syria if you have no idea whatsoever how to deliver that result. And that's the criticism that Robert Gates, the former Defense Secretary of the United States, made in his interview with the Wall Street Journal, where he was very critical of the administration that he served for several years. The problem with soft power is that if you put so much emphasis on it, you merely reveal to other people they don't have it. And if they don't have it, then they have only one recourse, which is hard power, which basically has, I think, been the Russian response to history. Thirdly, we really have to try to understand what our enemies, or putative enemies, are doing. So when we look at hybrid warfare on the part of the Russian Federation, we have to ask ourselves very difficult questions. Is this actually war? Is it just political leverage? Is it just a power play? Is it just the need to be noticed? Is it the ability to seize opportunities rather than to create those opportunities? In the Baltic states, to which you referred, obviously, there's ethnic homogeneity, there's a very weak civil society, and there are historical grievances. A wonderful mix for the Russians to use, but those are not replicated outside the Baltic states necessarily. There's that great Russian proverb, if you are not dining at the top table, you're likely to find yourself on the menu. If that is actually what hybrid warfare is all about, which is, I think, what the Russian intervention in Syria was about, making sure that you're at the top table rather than on the menu, then we can craft a strategy to deal with that. If we think it's more serious than that, if we think it's actually Russian revisionism, an attempt to actually change through force or intimidation the post-Cold War settlement, then we have to think again about what our options should be. It's very difficult to get this right, but this is how we have to think. The narrative is the fourth point. What is the story we want to tell? We knew what the story was in the case of the Soviet Union and the Cold War. I don't think we've crafted a narrative about where history's actually going and whether we are riding the wave of history or we're going to find ourselves beached by history. We told a narrative to ourselves that I think was increasingly unconvincing after 2007 about globalization, about the death of distance, about how geography was no longer important. None of those things are the stories that the Russians tell themselves. You tell them about the death of distance, they'll laugh at you. For them, distance is very real and always has been. So we have to make sure that we have a story which is not only believable to ourselves, but believable to the people that we are engaged in talking to. Gates, in his interview with the Wall Street Journal, said, "We don't know what the story is in the Middle East. We haven't a clue about the future of the Middle East, whether it's ISIS or Islamism in a different form, whether it's democracy, Tunisia, for example, whether it's authoritarianism, Egypt being the best case. We simply don't know the story." In the case of the Cold War, we knew the story. It was about capitalism versus communism. One was historically right, the other was historically wrong, and we just had to wait for the internal contradictions to manifest themselves. As the Russians told them the same story about themselves, about us, as we told about them. We waited for history that we thought we had decoded to deliver the inevitable result. We don't know what the inevitable result in the Middle East is. And this is why Gates says it's very difficult to tell a story. Fifth element, paradigms. We all have paradigms. The NATO paradigm was risk management and collective security after 1991. We did it extremely well. A new world where we looked at non-state actors and non-state forces rather than states, where we didn't look at intentionality, we looked at unintended consequences, where we looked at unknown unknowns, to use Donald Rumsfeld's very useful formulation, things we knew we didn't know and perhaps couldn't know before they actually happened. Problems with that particular paradigm, we kept piling up more and more unknown unknowns, and we couldn't prioritize in terms of concentrating resources on whether piracy or cyber terrorism or migration, global climate change, which of these was actually more important. But that was the paradigm, risk management. We did it well. It's there in the three strategic concepts, 1991, 1999, and 2010. Today we have two paradigms at the same time. We still are in the risk management business, but we're also in the threat management business. We're back into collective defense again, against two forces, Russia and ISIS. And it's difficult to juggle these two paradigms at the same time, to keep two conflicting ideas in your mind at the same time. That is the definition of wisdom. It's difficult for an organization to be able to do that. I'm coming to an end. Number 6, consequence management, it seems to me, is the name of the game. We have to be very careful that when crafting strategies, we don't create unintended consequences that we then find we can't deal with. The Russians themselves, for example, tell us that hybrid warfare is not their invention, that we invented it after 2007 in terms of trying to get regime change in Russia, having the orange revolutions, essentially destabilizing the world. They see this as a deliberate Western policy for which we are now reaping what we have sown as a result of the Russian reaction. That, of course, I think is a total misreading of what we were trying to do, but it's an interesting story for the Russians to tell. It's a very good propaganda story. We've got to be careful in crafting our strategies that we don't have to live with really bad side effects. The side effects, as you know, sometimes being worse than the original complaint for which you're taking the medication. So it's really what academic sociologists call the risk trap. Doing too much and doing too little are both equally problematic, and you've got to get it right. In the case of Syria, the Obama administration has done far too little. In the case of Iran, I think it's probably done what was necessary. I think Iran will be seen possibly as the great success story of the Obama administration. Syria is the great disaster, establishing red lines and then not actually defending them. Anyway, that's not NATO, that's the United States, but the same lesson, I think, applies consequence management. And finally, and this will be my last comment, always dealing with the so-called black swan events. That is, that yes, we're planning for Russia and ISIS today, but something can come along tomorrow that will put those into perspective and not boxing ourselves in. And I just want to give you, by way of ending, one example of boxing yourself in. It's telling yourself stories that unfortunately, are sidelined by history. Tony Blair, 1997, his first speech when he becomes Prime Minister. I'm probably the first Prime Minister in British history who will not be called upon to send soldiers into battle. A book subsequently was published called Blair's Wars. He fought 5 of them. 4, actually. He's actually fought more wars than any other post-war British Prime Minister. After 2001, there was only one tale. It was the global war on terror and nothing else. That was the only important thing for that administration. And his last speech on HMS Albion, the only purpose of the Royal Navy is to support British military operations in Afghanistan. That is not a purpose of any navy. It is to maintain the sea lanes. And I'm at a conference here tomorrow, a shipping owners conference, because they're worried about sea lanes and access, rules of the road, and freedom of navigation, whether it's the South China Seas or anywhere else, is once again coming into prominence. So, the quote I leave you with is by Philip Tetlock, who is a man well known in the Pentagon. He's a consultant. Knowing what we don't know is better than thinking that we know what we don't. That, yes, it takes some time to decode that. That's the beginning of wisdom. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Koke, for that very brief, to the point, and sharp reflection about threats and narratives and challenges, and leaving us with a rather gloomy picture, perhaps. The next speaker is Jeffrey R. Larson. And prior to taking up his NATO posting in 2013, Dr. Larson served as a consultant to a number of institutions and agencies, as well as to the U.S. Strategic Command, U.S. Northern Command, and Headquarters U.S. Air Force. A retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, he served 21 years as command pilot in Strategic Air Command and as Associate Professor of Political Science and Instructor Pilot at the Air Force Academy. He was also managing editor for the official U.S. Air Force Lessons Learned studies of its air operations over Kosovo, Afghanistan, as well as Iraq. And Dr. Larson also has, as you can hear, a PhD from Princeton University. And throughout his career, he has published extensively on issues in national security, nuclear weapons strategy, arms control, NATO, European politics, you name it. And a recent co-authored book is NATO Responses to Hybrid Threats from last year, which is also very relevant. So, Dr. Larson, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And check two. Is this working in the back? Yes? No? We'll assume it is. No? Okay. Well, thank you, and I'd like to thank the Institute for the invitation, especially Karsten and Nina for moderating. Knowing what my 2 colleagues were planning to address, I chose to focus on 2 areas. Before I do, though, I just want to bring greetings from Rome, where it was 24 degrees yesterday, so spring is coming. There's hope for these northern climes. The 2 parts to my talk will be first on some of the practical responses by the Alliance to the changed international security environment of the last 2 years, and then question whether this is enough. Have we pointed the Alliance in the right direction? And what will be the focus of this summer's summit in Warsaw? And the second part, I'd like to focus a little more in depth on strategic deterrence. Christopher raised this point throughout his talk. I'd like to do a short overview of the situation, talk about NATO's current and future nuclear policy, and then ask why this subject is back. Many of us thought it had disappeared over the last 15 years. But it is back because it's important today for an alliance that bases its security on the ultimate guarantee of nuclear deterrence. This subject is unlikely to be discussed publicly at the summit, but perhaps it should be. At least we hope smart people in the alliance are once again considering what it means to be a nuclear alliance. So, reaction to recent events. As a NATO official, I'm required to say we have no desire or perceived need to return to a Cold War. But there's an obvious need to respond to the events that have been taking place, particularly on our eastern flank, because there's a clear, growing, and dangerous military imbalance in Eastern Europe that could potentially be exploited by Moscow. And we don't have good responses. I will come back to that in a moment. Officially, our policy to the east is uncertainty. The alliance is divided between the need for deterrence and the need for greater dialogue with this potential adversary. The Secretary General and the Munich Security Conference said what we need is both, defense and dialogue. In the South, we are hands-off. The U.S.-led coalition has been dealing with ISIL to some extent of success, but the problem continues to grow. And as you all are very well aware, there are consequences to what's happening down there with the million-plus refugees that we now are seeing coming through Europe, mostly through Italy. They're bound for Norway and Sweden and the northern countries. To the north, again, NATO's policy is hands-off. In talking about the Arctic, the alliance prefers to let the Arctic Council take the lead on these issues. And of course, there are member states of NATO that don't wish to emphasize the North. Overall, the alliance is adapting to this new world, politically, militarily, and institutionally. And the recognition of this need by itself, I think, is a positive sign that the alliance, which is a slow and cumbersome bureaucracy, has at least finally awakened to the fact that the world has changed, there are new threats, and it needs to do something. So that's a positive. Now, I was going to talk a little bit about the Wales Summit, but I know this was the focus of the previous seminar, so I won't go through the long list of issues. You're all aware of them, the Readiness Action Plan, the Spearhead Force, or the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, the rejuvenated NATO Response Force. I'm pessimistic about any of these serving the purpose for which they're designed. And again, we can talk about that some more later. We have done a lot in the East, focused on the East. These were all good initiatives, and they all made the alliance stronger. And hopefully, they provided some measure of assurance to our Eastern member states and some measure of deterrence to Russia. Some of them are longer-term measures, which will continue to be implemented over the coming years. But the question is, was it enough? Did the Wales efforts and initiatives deter President Putin, or was he never really planning to do anything directly against NATO in the first place? It's sort of like the old question about deterrence. You can never prove if it's working. You only know after the fact that it failed. So, what does this mean for Warsaw? A lot of writings talk about the road to Warsaw, and I just saw one, I read one yesterday that I think is better. Because of the long-term adaptation process, we should think of this as a road through Warsaw, not the road to Warsaw, because there's a difference in our perspective. These issues and missions will continue after July. Well, there'll be a large number of issues addressed in Warsaw. Many of them will just be cleanup items, typical of any summit, which seem to be occurring pretty regularly now on a 2-year cycle. But they will be looking at the Wales initiatives to make sure we're on track, that we're doing what we said we would do there. But the main areas we're going to be emphasizing, as you're all aware, will be Russia and the east, and ISIL and failed states to the south. And how do we balance the alliance's response to in both directions? Again, deterrence will probably not be publicly discussed, but collective defense will, focusing more on conventional and cyber responses. This will not be an enlargement summit, so even though we expect to have another member of NATO by the end of the year, that has been taken in different committee circles so that it won't be a highlight of the summit. This was at the request of the hosts, I believe, that this not be seen as an enlargement summit. There'll also be a lot of talk about migration and counterterrorism, neither of which has been a core mission of the alliance, but you can see movement in this direction. And I think the people of Europe are going to be asking more of NATO. If you are a security alliance, why aren't you doing something? So the alliance does have a maritime force in the Aegean Sea now, monitoring, but it's the beginnings of something. And counterterrorism, again, given the attacks on cities throughout Europe, there has to be at least more cooperation with the EU, which I think is what our third speaker will be covering. There was a recent paper by the German Marshall Fund of the US that highlighted several recommendations for NATO at the next summit, and I recommend it to you. as they point out, simply making sure that the Wales efforts are on track won't be enough. This summit is more important than that. It will require emphasis on the existential challenge on the eastern flank, which will be our next topic, and what they call durable chaos on the southern flank. We need to use, as the alliance becomes more, places more emphasis on collective defense, particularly for the threat from the east, we don't want to surrender the experience and knowledge we have in the other two legs of the core missions of the alliance, crisis management and cooperative security. And both of those can be used to help us with the dangers to the south. We have several partnership organizations in the Middle East and North Africa. We have a lot of experience with out-of-area operations, both of which might help. And as I said, we need to manage the balance of responses to both directions in order to maintain alliance cohesion. Because I have to tell you, where I live, there's not a lot of concern about Russia and the Baltics. Okay? Italy is thinking about other things. They're thinking about the 9th year of a recession. They're thinking about the migrants coming across the Mediterranean. They're looking at their Navy and Coast Guard rescuing people almost every day. Now, it's slowed down in Italy since last year, but Russia is not at the top of their list, and that's true in many of the Mediterranean states. So we have to balance. In order to maintain the cohesion of alliance, we have to make all parties happy. But overall, I agree with Professor Coker. I believe the alliance has to reinforce its credibility in Warsaw as a strong, formidable military machine in the eyes of our allies and our partners and our potential adversaries. Yes, it is a political organization. It does have responsibilities in the Washington Treaty that go beyond simply military defense. But at its core, we are a security organization dedicated to the protection of Europe and the member states and their populations. So let me turn next to some strategic issues. I'll run through, I don't know if I have 7, but 5 or 6, with a focus on what it means to be a military alliance. Well, first, let's talk just about Russia for a moment. I believe Russia has a 19th century view of the world. I also believe none of us really knows how Russia thinks, because for the last 20 years, perhaps not so much in Norway, but in my home country and in the alliance, Russia has not been the focus that it used to be. Many decades ago, when I was an undergraduate, I majored in Soviet studies. That was a highly revered field during the Cold War. But in the last 20 years, we've seen an entire generation kind of lose that understanding and that study of this country. Now it's back. So you have old people like me up here talking to you about Russia. There are some young rising scholars who are studying Russia and deterrence and what it all means. And we hope that they will fill the gap, shall we say. But in my view, Moscow has a 19th century view. It believes in great power balancing. It believes in spheres of influence. It's upset over the continuing NATO enlargement and the out-of-area operations that NATO has carried out in our near abroad, if you will, in Kosovo and Libya. The question I would raise, and it's similar to Christopher's, is what drives the Russian leadership? What drives Putin? I have some more simple language, but is it fear or opportunism? Is there a legitimate fear on the behalf of Russia, of the West, of NATO, of the strength of Europe? And therefore, what they're doing is a natural response, an inclination to seek security for their own country. If that's true, then that should drive a certain set of policy prescriptions on our part. We should focus on dialogue. We don't want to emphasize that fear by building up military forces in the Baltics. But if Russia is acting out of opportunism, if they're looking for weaknesses and exploiting them when they can, then we do need to respond with strength and building up forces on our weak spots on the walls of our alliance. So not knowing what this potential adversary thinks, it is a great power, it is in Europe, we don't know the best policy response, and they're diametrically different. This is why it's so difficult for NATO to come up with a solution. Now, the most dangerous scenario that both previous speaker, the moderator, and our first speaker have mentioned is the one in the Baltic states. The Baltic states are threatened, and they feel threatened. We may not believe they're threatened. We may not believe that Russia really plans to do anything. But that's beside the point. We don't know what Russia's intentions are. We are a military alliance. We need to provide the assurance to our allies that we can and will protect them. The problem is that Russia currently has a 10-to-1 force ratio in the region. During the Cold War, there was a lot of writing about whether there was a 3-to-1 ratio on the east inter-German border would perhaps be sufficient to win an engagement. Well, they have a 10-to-1 balance. They are conducting large-scale SNAP exercises. They are backing those with nuclear saber rattling and threats. And we don't know if one day they might just turn left and, as a RAND study has said, capture the capitals of the Baltic states in fewer than 3 days. And we have nothing there that can stop them. Okay, not a good situation. Okay, well, we do have this VJTF, right, which will deploy 5,000 troops within 3 to 5 days. How are we going to do that after the fact? Who will make the political commitment to try and send this small force into an already captured territory when there's a Russian A2AD bastion in Kaliningrad that can protect the very narrow land corridor from Poland and can cover the Baltic Sea? You know, the odds of us being able to reinforce or retake the Baltics if they're lost are very low. Okay. Again, is this a likely scenario? Perhaps not. But since we have nothing but bad choices if it happens, my argument would be we should try to keep it from happening by a modest deployment of conventional forces in the region that can provide that assurance to our allies, and again, will hopefully provide some additional deterrence to against Russia. Because our only choices really in that case are war, with likely escalation and possible escalation to nuclear weapons by either side, because we do not have the conventional capability to win back those states, or the alternative is appeasement or surrender. Either of these could lead to the end of the alliance. So these are bad alternatives. I recommend we do something that will be expensive, but is a lot less expensive than the potential for these scenarios that I mentioned. Okay. All of that was conventional, by the way, what I'm recommending. But let's talk just for the last couple of minutes on deterrence and NATO's nuclear policy. There has been a renewed emphasis on collective defense and deterrence in the face of this Russian threat. Again, this does not mean abandoning the other two legs of the NATO mission, but it just means we need to beef up collective defense after 15 or 20 years of neglect. Deterrence, as the alliance always says, rests on an appropriate mix of conventional, nuclear, and missile defense forces. And the nuclear leg remains, quote, the supreme guarantee of alliance security. We also have statements from Secretary of State Clinton in Tallinn in 2010 and repeated in various NATO documents, including the Deterrence and Defense Posture Review of 2012, that as long as nuclear weapons exist, NATO will remain a nuclear alliance. This will require robust, well-trained, modern, and reliable nuclear forces. And the 2012 DDPR said that our preferred option in the alliance is to keep the status quo. The status quo means one delivery type, air-delivered bombs using dual-capable aircraft that involves nuclear sharing with a number of NATO allies in addition to the 3 nuclear powers. This maximizes the risk and responsibility sharing of the member states. So this is the official NATO position, that we have these weapons, we're going to keep these weapons, we rely on these weapons, and we don't want to change how we plan to use them for deterrence purposes. Now, nonetheless, these are still called political weapons. They don't have any military purpose per se. They are the ultimate deterrence insurance, the ultimate insurance policy. And we've seen a lot of significant reduction in reliance on these weapons since about 1990. Reductions in the numbers of systems, the number of warheads, the readiness levels. Again, during the Cold War, we had aircraft on strip alert that could be airborne within 3 minutes of warning. Today, official NATO documents say to prepare a nuclear strike package would take weeks to months to prepare. Okay. So what does this mean? We'll probably never use them in a NATO scenario. If it ever comes down to it, there will be other alternatives to using NATO forces. There are no peacetime contingency plans. There is no adversary. Therefore, there's no pre-designated target package like there used to be. And again, we always say that the circumstances in which any use of nuclear weapons might be contemplated are extremely remote. All true, but they're less remote today than they were 2 years ago. There are several upcoming decisions that will have to be made regarding non-strategic nuclear weapons or tactical nuclear weapons that are left in Europe. 3 in particular. First, politically, will the remaining weapons be allowed to remain in Europe, the remaining US weapons that are stationed across Central Europe? At the moment, the answer is yes, they will stay. I think discussion at headquarters has stopped on further reductions, given what's happening with Russia. The second question then is, if they're staying, what about the procurement? What about the medium-term lifespan of some of the fleets of DCA aircraft that your neighbors in Europe maintain? Some of them will age out within the next decade. Are there any plans to replace them or to keep this mission beyond that point? At the moment, it depends on the country that we're talking about. And third, do we really want to put more emphasis on nuclear deterrence once again, as we used to, in response to the actions of Russia? Or do we keep it quiet? Do we keep it low-key? The Wales Summit declaration was the longest communique in NATO history, 13,000 words. There are maybe 4 or 5 sentences in there, 200 words on nuclear deterrence. This was, I believe, an intentional step taken in 2014. I don't know what will happen in Warsaw, but I think we need to consider whether we want to emphasize deterrence more in Warsaw. Now, during questions, Q&A, if you'd like, I would be happy to discuss what the rationale for retaining these weapons could be. A couple of years ago, we would have been discussing the rationale for eliminating the remaining US nuclear weapons in Europe, but times have changed. And very quickly, without trying to come across as pro-nuclear, but this is, again, alliance policy, we see the role of these weapons as a deterrent against existential threats, as an indispensable link between the United States and European security, as a way of discouraging proliferation by allies, as a way of providing assurance to allies and to prevent feelings of abandonment or vulnerability, to create uncertainty in the minds of potential adversaries, possibly to provide bargaining chips for future arms control negotiations on these weapons. By the way, arms control, if you weren't already aware of it, is dead in Europe, and I don't see any chance of revival in the near term. And to prevent strains in the alliance in the debate that would ensue on whether or not to eliminate these weapons, particularly from countries like France, who have no desire to see NATO eliminate their weapons because France doesn't want to eliminate its arsenal either. So in conclusion, NATO is and remains the guarantor of European security. And NATO is placing renewed emphasis on its core mission, which is collective defense. It is a political and military alliance charged with defending its members' territory, its people, and its interests. And I would argue that all the other missions that have been added since the early 1990s are secondary to this core mission of defense. And perhaps the alliance can or should remind the world of this core responsibility in Warsaw this summer. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for those that focused and also interesting analysis of NATO and its many strategic and operational challenges and choices. So our third speaker today is Henrik Breitenbach. How do you pronounce your name, by the way? Breitenbach, yeah. Not that as good as in Danish. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of Copenhagen, and he's been one senior researcher at the Center for Military Studies there since 2010. And over the years, you've been guest researcher at the Centre Européen de Sociologie et de Sciences Politiques in Paris. You've been a resident fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations at the Paul Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And you are also a senior non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington since 2014. And while a researcher at the Danish Institute for Military Studies, during 2006 and 2010, you were actually on loan to the Defense Command Denmark and was sent voluntarily, it was emphasized in your CV, to serve as lead writer for NATO's Allied Command Transformation and the Command's Multiple Futures project, a future study serving as a basis for the Alliance's long-term defense planning. And with that background, and also with your publications on security and Danish security policy and defense planning and NATO, I think you're well placed to give us your reflections about the questions we are talking about today. Warm welcome.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much for having me. Of course, it befalls the fellow Scandinavian to seek a consensual middle between the two preceding presentations. So I'll see if I can achieve that in my allotted time span. The title I have given my little talk here is the triangle of European security, looking forward to the Warsaw Summit. And when I use the word triangle, it's both in a literal and in a figurative sense. Normally, when we talk about things that are hard to do, we talk about squaring the circle. But in this case, I think the heads of state that will show up in Warsaw in some ways are asked also to square the triangle of European security. That is, that they have to find some solutions within a set of constraints within the overall security context of European security as it is. And that, I think, can be depicted in the simplest way as a triangle. It's a triangle where the three corners are respectively the east, the south, and the center. Of course, for each of the three corners, there are a problem set. There are in these times that are so marked by financial concerns, we can use an economic language and say that, well, each of them are marked by a demand side and a supply side. So there are some problem sets, there are some issues that we go out to resolve, and then there are some means with which we try to address them. And I think Professor Coker talked about the different kinds of paradigms that underlie these supply side issues. What is it that we try to do to the problems that we are confronted with? So for each of the three corners, there is a demand side and a supply side issue in a sense. And evidently, I could talk about this for perhaps 3 hours, but I'll try to finish this in about 12 minutes from now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges or the demand side issues in the east and the south, and then surprisingly also the center. Of course, the east and the south, you may already have guessed what they look to, but the center has to do with European strategic attention and decision-making ability. Let me get back to that in a second. And then on the supply side, and I think we can return perhaps to that in the discussion, but I think there's a number of challenges, and one of the specific supply side issues I would like to look at is the one that has to do with the supply side issue with regard to the east, namely deterrence that we have already been talking about. With regard to the south, I think it's more an issue of stabilization that we have to discuss, and it's not so much necessarily NATO, but it's also the West and world society and Europe as a community that has to become better at stabilizing conflicts. If we look at the east, of course, the challenge is pretty clear. We have in Putin's increasingly totalitarian and certainly authoritarian kleptocracy a formidable problem. It's not just the problem that we had in the 90s, where we sort of tried to, and the early noughties, where we tried to imagine Russia as sort of a Sweden with nukes. And in that kind of imagination, of course, was always a bit of a stretch of imagination that we would sort of casting Russia in a prospective role as an easygoing member of the Western liberal democratic club that would increasingly grow into becoming, yes, Sweden, but with nukes. And then we would try to forget about the nukes, and then everything would be happy, as it has been for most of the recent history for those countries who neighbor Sweden. Of course, not all of the history for those countries neighboring Sweden. But Russia, in that way, confronts us with two sets of actually something very unfashionable, namely hard security issues. There is first and foremost the issue of deterrence. Russia apparently is not willing to follow the rules of the road. The rules of the road that have been established in a very basic way since the end of World War II by the victors of World War II, namely that you respect the borders and the territorial integrity of the other countries as they can be depicted on a political map that we have all agreed upon. If Russia is not willing to abide by those rules, then we have, as the saying goes, a new situation. And so I think in some ways for us Europeans who have sort of de-learned to deal with hard security issues like that and actively through the European Union project pretended that they would not exist, we have to rediscover what it is to live with a giant lizard in the backyard. There is actually something that the neighbor has that is not just a cuddly dog, but there is a dangerous animal in the backyard, and we have to take some kind of precautions in order to deal with that. The second part of the hard security issue here is all of the hybrid challenge that comes with what Putin is doing and the means that he is using. Because was it only the classical Cold War issues, then most of our military and intelligence institutions would probably be able to dust off some manuals, and I think at least some of them are pretty eager to get back into the Cold War mindset. But the problem is that much of the confrontation with Putin is not only about hard deterrence, it's also about basically a political confrontation, political warfare you may call it, or a political struggle that involves intelligence, subversion, and all of the sets of the KGB playbook from the Cold War that are not about direct military confrontation. The point is, of course, if we look a little bit at Putin's own threat perception, is that he's in an extremely vulnerable position. Of course, he has zero legitimacy. The one that he has is manufactured through the overt use of propaganda in his extended media state apparatus. But he's very scared of an uprising from below. He's very scared of liberal democracy. He's very scared of active Western involvement in the color revolutions, and that there is a plot out to get him ever since the last elections in 2011. So he's actively trying to counter that, and his major story here is that basically everybody's out to get him. So he's paranoid, and of course not completely without reason. Maybe even if you're diagnosed as paranoid, you may still be pursued, of course. So Putin's positive agenda in this context, or not positive to us, is of course to try to undermine the front that he sees is gathering against him. So he tries actively to undermine European unity. He tries perhaps even to sow the chaos that goes on to the south of Europe. Certainly we know that he has not been actively counter-ISIL to any large extent. He has been pro-Assad in the intervention down there. So Putin's center of gravity, basically, I would say, is Western unity and European unity. That kind of unity that is necessary for a shared European vision, a shared European threat perception, and shared European and Western and allied decision making. So Putin uses a number of means to undermine our ability to actually make decisions, and I think that is an important aspect of the entire situation leading up to the Warsaw Summit. Now, seen from the center, this is one specific challenge that, of course, has a lot of complexity to it, as we have already seen, and it reaches out and down to the southern corner. But by and large, it's, even if it's not a rerun of the Cold War, but it's anyway sort of a well-known threat to security researchers, to the extent that our opponent here has agency. There is actually a guy. There's somebody we can hate a little bit, and we can laugh at him in the shirtless pictures riding a bear or whatever that's on the internet. But at least there's an adversary who has agency, who does something actively, and we can try to think how to outwit him, or at least try to avoid falling into the traps that he would be setting up. So the East-West logic, or the Eastern problem here, that kind of logic of confrontation that we see, is a logic of threats stemming from the strength of others. And our entire security policy apparatus is designed to think about threats stemming from the strength of others. And so, in a sense, even if it's kind of weird with the political warfare and the subversion, we can get our minds around to think about it. But things are complicated, more complicated, when we look at the challenges from the south. I think what you can put as a headline here in spite of the fact that it's easy to hate ISIL, is that most of the threats, the threat package, the problem package that you see on the southern corner of the triangle, is basically that the threats that are here, they stem from the weakness of others. So they stem from weak institutions, they stem from the absence of states as we recognize them, they stem from the absence of relatively well-functioning state-society relationships and institutionalized ways of doing politics without violence. All of the things that we have come to take for granted in our little Scandinavian paradise. The problem, of course, is that we have an arc of crisis reaching from the south of Russia all over the Middle East, through North Africa, on the east side of Africa, all the way to Nigeria. An arc of crisis where states are fragile, where radicalism is spreading, and where the basic state-society contract has, if not completely collapsed, then at least been eroded to a point after as shown with the uprisings around the time of the so-called Arab Spring, that we can see a very large structural crisis continuing for the rest of our lifetime and perhaps even our children's. We have right now over 60 million refugees or internally displaced persons. UNHCR Chief Guterres said that the crisis has reached unprecedented proportions. And all of these migrants and refugees, well, by echoing the words of noted political scientist Albert Hirschman, well, they have no voice in their countries since they're not well-functioning countries with well-functioning state-society relationships. Of course, evidently they're not liberal democracies in any meaningful way. And they have, of course, then little loyalty to the state project, so they choose the exit and they leave. And they're going to continue doing that, especially because most of the population pyramids in Northern Africa look like this. And there was no chance in hell that they're going to be able to have labor markets that will suck up all of these young people. So welcome to a continuing problem. Now, this is not particularly relevant to the NATO summit, you might say. Yes, but the problem is that at the third corner of the triangle, namely the center, there is a limited set of attention span. If you imagine your own desk at the, I mean, this is a reality where most of us, in very practical terms, every day sit at a desk and there's a computer in front of us and a pile of papers. There's a limited amount of space. But that's the same thing for the Prime Minister and for the Prime Minister's advisor and for the Prime Minister's advisor's advisor. And so in the end of the day, you can only deal with so many issues. And the problem is that the southern problem and the eastern problem are extremely complex, each one of them at the same time. But together, they compound the problem of a lack of strategic attention in Europe. And so what we really have here is that I kind of agree with the Putin analysis of where the center of gravity is, namely in terms of European unity. There's a sense of crisis in all of the European nations because of finances, because of the migration crisis, because of an erosion in trust in international institutions. All of the politicians to the left and the right are running back towards the nation state, and that's very sound because it's the building block of our international community. But on the other hand, if everybody does that, then nobody's at the helm to deliver the leadership that's needed to not only confront Putin, but also to find effective solutions with regard to the South. So we have an extremely, I think, somber outlook for our institutional cooperation overall in Europe. And I think that is one of the major problems that we are facing. Of course, we know that institutions basically only learn through crisis. It's only after failure that you really change your ways of behavior. So in a sense, maybe the current crisis is something that can spur a renewed sense of unity, of purpose, but I'm not too optimistic. Perhaps with regard to the South, where stabilization is moving up the agenda, we need to get better at solving those kinds of conflicts in order to not have all those people coming running up here, and also, of course, for their sake. But with regard to the northern corner, or the eastern corner, the east-west issue, with regard to deterrence, it's even more difficult. The problem, I think, here is that because the military organizations have been relearning deterrence for the last 2 years and thinking about it, it's not as straightforward as it seems. At the Wales summit, what the headline was basically to our military reactions inside the NATO track was about reassurance. But very last week, General Breedlove said, well, now we have moved from reassurance to actually deterrence. Now we're talking about being able to deter the Russians from from using from being able to use military means to confront NATO. But the problem is here that deterrence, the cornerstone of deterrence is credibility, and credibility is not just about military measures, it's also about the political unity that's behind the ability to actually act in case you're called upon to do so. And that unity of action, that unity behind the credibility of NATO's proposed deterrence is crumbling slowly. So towards the end, let me round up with some observations for what that means, I think, for the small European countries inside NATO. I think because European unity is the sense of gravity also for us, or in this case, with regard to NATO, transatlantic unity, I think smaller nations are harder pressed than ever before, because the multilateralism that we used to be able to take for granted is not necessarily there. Even in the case where we need leadership, it's left to the larger European countries to get their act together, and there we're dependent on the personal capacities of specific leaders, like is Merkel able to get her act together inside Germany? Is she able to cajole people together across the European front? What about Cameron? Is he part of the game at all? And is Hollande able to lift his eyes from the terror threat coming from the south? So those are big questions. And it's in particular because NATO is not the only forum for unity. Small countries that are not part of the overall structure, like Norway, is in a particularly vulnerable situation, because Norway and other small countries are also dependent on the political consultation that goes on inside the European Union and that kind of game that happens there. So as very briefly in the end, as a set of takeaway recommendations, please think about the deterrence, do the deterrence and the military part of it properly, and I'm looking forward to some hopefully good decisions on that at Warsaw. But also put some emphasis on diplomacy and strengthen the internal Western debate in order to enable unity. And then, in particular, with regard to Russia, manage and strengthen some relation that with Russia that respects Russia's self-image. Russia wants to be able to be this kind of lizard or be living in the 19th century. So let them do that in a way, but let's not accept that they bully their neighbors in the process. We have to find a way to do that. So we have to create a narrative that includes Russia, that's not just about the cozy Western European club, but a narrative that includes Russia, but not a Russia that is seen as a Sweden with nukes. And then most of all, work to restore predictability and patterns, everything that is patterned or rituals with Russia, so that we can avoid misunderstandings, including the military maneuvers. I think the risk of misunderstandings is a significant threat. And that's kind of also one of those threats that is without agency, but is still a valid one. If we don't work hard to contain possible misunderstandings, that's where the real risk is that something will run amok at some point. Thank you.
Thank you, Henrik, for that thought-provoking and also very good talk, and indeed the recommendations that you made towards the end here. We now heard three excellent and inspiring in the sense that it will at least spur some debate introductions. And I will now open up the floor for comments and questions. And we have some 30, perhaps 40 minutes for that. But before you get the microphone from Liv here, please, when you get it, state your name and affiliation. I don't know who was first, but I was looking at him. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the panelists. My name is Pervis Sulgi Kazai. I'm a former diplomat and actually the central board member of the Norwegian Labour Party International Forum, but I'm talking on behalf of myself here. It was very interesting, the deliberations, and I have a few points to raise to the panelists. One was, as Mr. Cocker said, we have to show power. And without the power, without necessarily using the power, we are toothless. As Chancellor Bismarck said it once to negotiate on the international relationship and have diplomatic transactions without having power is just like arranging a chamber orchestra without musical instruments. So my second point is about the South, the Middle East problems. I wonder if at the level of NATO, one could really necessarily or honestly criticize the United States for two big blunders in the Middle East. One is a blunder of action by Mr. Bush to change the whole geopolitical situation of Iraq and give it as in a silver plate to the Iranian regime with Maliki, a Shia pro-Khamenei, as the head of the Iraqi government for 8 years, and that really triggered ISIS because before, as you know, the awakening people of Sunnis, they were fighting against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And the third, my third point to raise is this optimism about this nuclear deal with the Iranian regime. Yes, that could be positive. That has triggered already internal problems in Iran between the hardliners and the softliners. But the regime has been more encouraged to involve totally in the Middle East military affairs, like in Yemen, like in Syria. We have the information that right now regime has 69,000 soldiers, Iranian, Hezbollah, and also Pakistani Shias and the Afghans. How do you envisage this giving diplomatic success to the regime and to the nuclear power, but at the same time attizing the regime's aggression in the Middle East? Thank you.
I think we'll take one more question, perhaps the one next. For practical reasons, I've seen you guys.
Hello, my name is Line Tresselt. I work in the business sector, but I had my degree on NATO-Russia relations. So, of course, this topic is interesting. Firstly, I wanted to say that from a Norwegian context, our relationship with Russia is very good, and we don't really feel that Russia is a clear threat to us. At least most people do not. So, but I think a lot of people are feeling now with Brussels, Paris, and the attacks and everything that's happening that the threat situation is more complex than ever. But both perhaps NATO and the different countries don't have the tools to deal with this situation. So with this kind of background, I'm wondering if perhaps you could say a little bit more on what one of you touched upon, the cooperation with the EU and the need for more and better intelligence in Europe and the counter-terrorism actions that could be taken. And yeah, just a few words on that. Thank you.
I think since you had 3 questions, we might start while people still remember. Anyone want to go first? Coco?
Yeah, so we can just address your question, first of all, on power. Unfortunately, we have different cultural constructions of power. Colin Powell, when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, used to have on his desk a saying from Thucydides, of all exercises of power, restraint is the most important. Thucydides never actually said that, but he might have said it, which is why it's an interesting idea. It's completely non-Russian, that their history, based on a correct or incorrect reading of it, is that you either have power or you don't. Powerlessness is always punished. And to be ignored is fatal for you. when the Bush administration came to power in 2001, the first paper the National Security Council wrote was on the future of Russia. And dismissed Russia as being of no great interest to anyone in the international system for the next 15 years. Why? Because it was failing to take advantage of globalization. It's a typical case where we came up with a story, globalization, and then we judged everyone and measured everyone's power according to whether it was globalized or not. It's a little unfortunate, of course, when 20 years later, Sergei Lavrov says we're a minority stakeholder in globalization. We don't do it. You people do. So for you, interdependence is a problem. For us, there is no interdependence, and that is a source of strength. So I think we've really got to understand how the Russians understand power and how they measure our own power, or in this case, powerlessness. Are they quite as powerful as they project themselves? No. The Crimea has been a disaster for them financially. Kaganov said recently that this corporate raid, it was like taking someone's very expensive cell phone and forgetting to steal the charger. And if the Crimeans had an open referendum today, 80% would vote to rejoin Ukraine. That's the reality of the situation. But again, that's our measurement, success and failure. The use and utility of power is measured in terms of success or failure, usually economic success or economic failure. It's not theirs. They fired a shot across the bows. They got us to take attention of them. For them, that has been a remarkable success. And who cares about international law and sovereignty? Because they certainly think we don't care very much about international law or sovereignty, by the way. And that is, I think, a genuinely held belief. And Michael Mandelbaum said that Russia's position in the international order were to be a perpetual spoiler. Rather like those fairy stories, you know, where the fairy godmother is not invited to the banquet and she turns up unexpectedly, she's not on the guest list, and havoc immediately ensues. I think that is Russia's role from now on, to be a perpetual spoiler. And they get away with it, and they've done quite well so far. We have to manage that, and we've got to find a strategy to manage it. And your question of the European Union and NATO, well, this is actually going to be, I think, discussed at Warsaw. It's going to be very important, the institutional relationship between those two organizations. We've been talking about it for 10 or 15 years. Nothing has come of it. Both organizations are the weaker because of it. The European Union is really the weaker because of it. And it's time for some very serious thinking. But who, of course, which country has constantly been the spanner in the works? My own country has been the spanner in the works, not wanting to discuss EU-NATO cooperation. And of course, we may no longer be a member of the EU in a few months' time. So I feel very pessimistic about this, because I think there is no political will in the European Union by this generation of politicians to get serious about this institutional relationship. And although I think there is serious political will in NATO, it's in the end, NATO is not the demandeur in this relationship. It's the EU that has to make all the running. I think this is serious. And I think the Europeans need to confront that head on.
Yeah, real quickly, the blunders in the Middle East. Yes, the United States made some. I used to think that if we had done what we did in Afghanistan and pulled out the next year, if we had accepted President Bush saying whether you think we should have gone there or not in Iraq, if we had accepted mission accomplished and left, given it back to their own people, things might have turned out better. Unfortunately, NATO then did the same thing in Libya and blew things up and then didn't follow up, and it's not turned out better. So I'm not sure there's a model here except to stay the heck out of the Middle East. I mean, that might be the answer. There has not been a successful effort yet, and it's been very costly for all of us. So, I'm listening closely to the isolationist strand in America's election this year, because it's not what you want to hear in Europe, but perhaps NATO and Europe needs to be a little more isolationist. The problem is they're your neighbors, and you suffer the effects of things not going well down there. So I don't have an answer except to agree with you. There have been mistakes, but I wouldn't say the United States was the sole source of all those, since, again, we have a NATO mission that tried to do the same thing. On the Iran agreement, I don't know what to think on the Iran agreement. On the one hand, I'll review the common perspective, I think it will restrict their nuclear capabilities for the next decade or 15 years, but at substantial cost to the West. The $100+ billion that was returned to them and sudden funding and influx of money, which the proponents argue will be used to rebuild Iran and to restore their position in the international marketplace. But it could just, that's a lot of money. Some of it's going to go to nefarious actors that were going to want to hurt us. So, and there's no control on conventional missile development. So even though the warheads are delayed for a decade goes by fairly quickly in our business. And they'll have potentially considerably better delivery systems than they do now. So was it a good deal? I don't know yet. Honest opinion.
Well, I think you mentioned sort of the distinction between the different types of threat perception, that sort of the ability of terror to the events in Brussels, for example, or in Paris, to capture our imagination, as opposed to the problem with Russia. And I think it plays into evident into the sort of the productivity of terror as a tool. It's extremely colorful. It captures our imagination, and it seems really close and scary. And in that way, you can sort of categorize these kinds of terror acts as high probability, but on the other hand, also relatively low impact, because the terrorists cannot really change our societies. Only ourselves and our reactions can change our societies. But the problem with Putin is the opposite. It's a low probability, but high impact in case we have World War III, of course. But inside that, there is an issue of order, and it's very hard to get excited about order. I mean, in terms of mobilizing threat perception and mobilizing threat understanding, it's harder to say, well, we need to have more unity and more diplomacy. Nobody really gets excited about that. And that's of course is a challenge for the politicians. And so on the NATO-EU cooperation, I think it's an extremely important discussion, and we've been having it for several decades, of course. But I think in the only toolbox issue where it really matters is regard to stabilization in sort of post-conflict stabilization issues. It doesn't really matter with regard to counterterrorism, because it's an intelligence issue, and we can solve that without NATO, basically. The point is here that is much more an issue of political leadership, again, especially at the European level, about working together on these issues. And in my own country, in spite of the obvious need for more cooperation on this, underscored again by the Brussels attacks, we just voted no to more police cooperation. So there is clearly a lack of popular understanding, a lack of political and popular will to have more integration, even if that's from the technocratic perspective is exactly what we need. So also there's a very somber outlook for more and better cooperation.
Thank you. There was a question down there. Oh, with the red sweater.
Thanks to the panel for your insights. My name is Frode Ashford. I come from a Norwegian NGO called No to Nuclear Weapons. Dr. Larsen, you briefly mentioned NATO's nuclear strategy and sharing agreement among 5 European countries. My question is very simple. Although this program is very expensive, there's an ongoing life extension programs for these weapons, namely the B-61 bomb. I was wondering if you could perhaps discuss whether or not the new capabilities of these weapons will also trigger adversaries to make new nuclear weapons with new capabilities that are perhaps more likely to be used in, conflict scenarios that might come up. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll have the one at the front here. With at least one more question here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. My name is Berg, retired from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. To touch a little bit on the deterrence aspect and the nuclear question. I remember during the Cold War things, when I did the NATO desk in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Brits had a saying going like this: in the uncertainty lies the deterrence. In the uncertainty lies the deterrence. My question to you would be, is this still the rule of the game, to keep the uncertainty, because that is where we have the deterrence? And one of you gentlemen mentioned a little bit that the need to avoid, misunderstandings. But in this very line on uncertainty, of course, lies a certain moment. And to take that a little bit step further before I throw in my towel, then it would be on the nuclear question. If you all the time say, as some people say in NATO, that these are only political weapons and they will never be used, then how can you convey the impression that these are, after all, military weapons? You cannot exclude the possibility of its use. There must be a certain dilemma here. Thank you.
My name is Christine Brusgaard. I am with the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies, and I would like to thank the panel for very interesting comments. And I will continue on this focus on nuclear deterrence with yet another question for Jeff, relating to, as the previous commentator mentioned, the credibility of NATO's nuclear deterrence, and you mentioned, Jeff, the alert status of NATO's nuclear capabilities. I was wondering if you could comment a bit more on your thoughts and sort of alliance thinking on how to establish credibility in terms of NATO's nuclear capabilities. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think we'll just leave those questions with the panel. I mean, welcome to Norway. Questions about nuclear deterrent. Okay.
Okay, the second question first on deterrence and uncertainty. I think it is still true. I believe that's one reason that the statements in the Wales Declaration were so spare regarding nuclear deterrence, that we did not want to emphasize it, that we believe that Moscow knows it's still there. They're certainly aware that we still have nuclear weapons, that we have delivery capabilities, that we have a policy. NATO, as a reminder, still does not have a no first use policy. We would escalate if necessary in a conflict. And we just didn't want to overemphasize that, because we didn't want to, we would never want to say exactly what our response would be, nor did we want to escalate the rhetoric about this level of warfare. The danger, of course, is that, as you inferred in the last part of your question, if we continually say these are political weapons, there's really no value, they don't matter, we only have a few hundred left, then somebody might begin to believe that we really don't rely on these weapons and the credibility is lost. Therefore, that's why I think we need to perhaps make some more public statements, at least, reminding the world that we are a military alliance, that we do have these weapons, that we always have had them, at least since 1952 in Europe, 1949 since the beginning of the alliance, that we do rely on them. Or maybe we should just be honest as an alliance and say, okay, we really wouldn't ever rely on these, we really wouldn't use them, so why do we still have them? Let's get rid of these, it'll save a little bit of money, it makes life simpler, but then we need the conventional deterrence to replace it. Because if you start removing systems right now with a Russia and a Putin and the leadership there that we don't totally understand what they're up to, I think that could be a temptation for him to just try something. And his goal is, I don't think his goal is to take territory. I don't think as we've heard, his goal, I believe, is to undermine the coherence and cohesion, of the alliance and of Europe. And you do that by creating a crisis that splits the member states. So we don't want to put ourselves in a position where a move on our part leads to that kind of response. And the alliance, therefore, has agreed that even though most of the underlying assumptions of the 2012 DDPR have changed, the decision to stay to the status quo and not make any further reductions and not make any changes at the moment remains the policy of the alliance. This includes improved capabilities, not new weapons, but the improved capabilities, the B-6112. And I will not go into details on it, but you can read everything Hans Christensen has ever written, and he's very good, and I read his stuff too. Will these new, if you will, new capabilities or an improved warhead design, will that lead to an adversary potentially developing something equivalent? Well, it might, yes. Is that going to stop us? No, because we're pretty well down that road, and it makes sense just from a technical point of view. These are old weapons. The changes that are being made will make it more accurate, will mean that we can use lower yields if we ever had to actually use them, which reduces collateral damage. They become more efficient. It's just, you know, the next phase in the technological lifespan of these types of weapons. I would not be surprised to learn that Russia is already doing many of the same things on their systems, or will follow suit. But it will be a lot more expensive for them because we have a couple of hundred, they have a couple thousand tactical nuclear weapons. And my reading of Russia is they've never worried too much about the greatest and latest technology that reduces yield or fallout. They like numbers and mass, and so having several thousand is fine from their point of view. Anyway, I'll stop there. Oh, Kristen, thanks for the question. How do we restore the credibility of the alliance nuclear capability? That's a very good question.
We'll leave that open for now, unless
Christopher can answer.
Yeah.
Just touching on 2 points. First of all, the ambiguity issue. Of course, the official British nuclear doctrine since the 70s has been calculated ambiguity, which I think is a very sensible position. Unfortunately, Jeremy Corbyn has torpedoed that one by saying that on no circumstances would he ever authorize the use of nuclear weapons, even if the United Kingdom were under nuclear attack, which, much to the fury of his political front bench and his political party, because it makes a complete nonsense of the British deterrent. You might as well scrap it at that point, quite frankly. So calculated ambiguity has always been there, but it has been an official British policy, and it is there for the renewal of the Trident program. On the China side, it's just an unfortunate reality. The Russia side, I will get to China in a second. The Russian side, the Russians take nuclear weapons extremely seriously, because since the 1970s, it has been their chief currency of power. You know, my country has been in the top 6 economies of the world for the last 120 years. Russia has gone from being the number 2 to having an economy smaller than the Netherlands in the 1980s, now smaller than Mexico today. It's actually 15th the largest economy in the world, according to some measurements. It's gone from 7 to 15 in 5 years. Now, when you have that degree of volatility in terms of being a great power and how you measure great power and how you see yourself as a great power, then you can only fall back on the one thing that you've got that others don't have, which is a preponderance of nuclear weapons. Whether you're the largest nuclear power, which is obviously what they want to achieve, or whether it's parity with the United States, that's a reality. The other reality is China. 39% of Russian armed forces are on the frontier with China, including some of the most modernized conventional forces. 1/10 of Russian territory is claimed by China. And if you're a young Chinese citizen looking at your patriotic history courses, you're not only reminded of the iniquities of what the British did in the Opium Wars, but you're also reminded of the fact that at the Second Opium War, the Russians used that to seize a very large amount of territory, which the Chinese want back eventually. The only way they can defend themselves on the Chinese frontier is with local nuclear theater superiority, which they have in a very amplified form. The joke of the PLA Academy is that when we invade Russia, we'll never be able to defeat it because we won't be able to find the Russian armed forces. And if you know that that's a joke being made about you by your so-called Chinese allies, you need those nuclear weapons.
you want to add something? And we also have a couple of more questions. So.
Well, just a quick note then on the relationship between credibility and uncertainty. I think one of the big issues inside of that relationship between the two is the question whether the burden of proof lies with the use or the non-use. I mean, what is the problem that our adversaries think we will not use the weapons, or that we might use them? So, to which side does the weakness appear? And I think a part of the solution to that is basically found in U.S.-Russian bilateral relations, because in the end of the day, what should really scare the Russians is what the Americans will do, not what the alliance will do. So to a certain extent, to the extent that there's a difference between what is NATO policy and what is American NATO policy, then that remnant, which is not the same thing as American NATO policy, is a bit of theater. And what really matters is what the American ambassador in Moscow says behind closed doors. And thank God for that, because if our security really rested on, aggregate European effort, then we should really worry. Thank you.
Wow. Okay, 2 quick questions, if you please. Only room for 2. Carsten Fries of NUPI. Oh no, sorry. We'll start with you since you're not at NUPI. Courtesy.
Okay, thank you. My name is Stein Iversen. I work at the International Department at the Norwegian Parliament. Just a very quick question, footnote in this discussion. But did I hear correctly that, I think you, Mr. Stoker, said that if there were a referendum on the Crimean Peninsula today, 80% would vote to rejoin Ukraine? Did I hear correctly? And if so, where do you have that information from? Okay.
Thank you. Fries.
Thank you. I'd like to return to the conventional deterrence, if I may. You all pointed out to the kind of, we don't really know what Russia or Putin is thinking. We don't know, therefore we don't know exactly the policies, what will be the right way to do it. But if it's true that Breedlove now has said that now we're actually in the game of deterrence, I guess they must be referring to the rotating American brigade that's going thither. And then some criticism might be made that this is not really deterrence, military speaking, because it's 5,000 troops. It doesn't really militarily make a difference. Are we then basically sending a symbolic signal, which is kind of, for Russia, is kind of proving that NATO is encroaching Russia, but we don't show any strength? Is it counterproductive?
Quickly, the woman behind there. I love his name, Breedlove. Yeah.
It's my name is Trine Eklund from the Norwegian Peace Movement. We already have 2 crises in Europe that split Europe, and I don't think of Russia, but I think of the refugee situation and the terror attacks that we now frequently see. And I wonder, what tools do NATO have to solve this or stop it or whatever you want? You cannot use nuclear weapons. You cannot use nuclear power to stop it in Europe. What other tools do you have?
Okay, thank you. Now I'll leave those questions with the panel, and you could also use the opportunity to say a few words on whatever you would like to say, because after that we're finishing up. Thank you.
Yeah, there you go. So on the question of conventional deterrence is counterproductive because there's not enough. I think perhaps, but the question then sort of implies that we can calculate how much would be enough, and that there is sort of an escalation ladder, a deterrence escalation ladder, where we can, project this number of brigades will be enough to deter Putin. And I don't think that's how deterrence works. And I think that's one of the traps of when we look forward to the Warsaw Summit. There will be discussion of whether this is enough or not. I think deterrence, in the end of the day, is political, and I think that what matters is not so much exactly how many brigades are there, but that there are enough of them and that they have American flags on the shoulders. Because again, it's the Russian ambassador behind the closed door in the Kremlin telling Putin, look, if you do this, stuff will happen. And that's the essence of deterrence in this case. So we can discuss endlessly how many brigades are necessary, but we will not actually achieve a good target. I think, though, that it's true that there may be some counteractions from the Russian side, but I also think it's necessary that we move from reassurance to deterrence. So we just have to manage relations with the Russians, and on our side to be as transparent as possible to avoid misunderstandings. Just quickly on the question on what we can do with the South. Well, I think generally that the European nations, not so much necessarily in a NATO context, but as also in a development context, should become much better at managing conflicts and ending conflicts. Stop focusing on development nations, the Ghanas of the world that function well, and focus instead of those where the people have the most suffering. So where there's a lot of rape and killing, focus on that and focusing on ending conflicts. That may actually mean using military means, getting better at doing stabilization, both hard stabilization and the more long-term softer stabilization. But we have to move away from the useless paradigm of development aid for its own sake and done in places where there's not a lot of suffering. We have to spend the money where there is a lot of suffering in order to get rid of it. So there is a lot of solutions there.
Okay, yes, the problems with deciding what to do and how much we need and whether to permanently put them in place or have a rotational presence, I think all of this reflects an attempt to balance the need, on one hand, to assure our Eastern allies that NATO will be there and cares about them. On the other hand, to provide a viable collective defense capability that will avoid some of these bad outcomes of the scenario I described earlier. And on the third hand, to avoid aggravating Russia by doing too much, because we want to keep, collectively, we want to keep alive the NATO-Russia Founding Act. We don't want to cut all ties with Russia. We don't want to re-enter the Cold War. I mean, we did cut all practical ties in April of 2014. We have not restored those, but at the highest levels, there have been some ongoing discussions. And at the worker levels, I've learned in Brussels, there are still discussions between desk officers and their Russian colleagues outside of the building. You know, they meet for lunch and that. So there are people trying to maintain the dialogue, and we want to avoid exaggerating the situation such that it gets worse. So this reflects that balance, and the people at SHAPE, at the various headquarters and planners, who are again planning for the first time in many years for scenarios like this, you know, they're struggling. It's difficult. They don't have the experience. No one's thought about this for a long time, and there are lots of issues to balance. By the way, the United States is part of this, and I'm glad you brought that up. If you recall, in 2012, the United States president announced there would be initially a pivot or a rebalance of U.S. attention to the Pacific, to the Asia Pacific, because that's where the future is. That's where the next big adversary we thought potentially might be. That's where most of our trade today comes from. That hasn't been much of a pivot. It's been more of a pirouette, if you will, because we tried to think about moving to the Asia Pacific, and we're being drawn back. And the United States recognizes the importance of Europe, the solemn commitments we've made to our European allies, and the responsibility. We don't like paying 70+% of NATO's budget and being the one that's always called on to provide forces, but we are, and we know that. So you're seeing the return of forces to exercises in the Baltics. You're seeing a major increase this year in the budget for infrastructure improvements to be able to reinforce the Baltics that the United States will pay for. I think all of these are signs that the U.S. isn't leaving anytime soon. And tools for the two major crises in Europe, the migrant and terrorist issues, officially NATO, those aren't NATO's job. I mean, no, you're right. Military forces and nuclear weapons cannot deal with those crises. So as a result, NATO has chosen to keep hands off. But as I said in my statement, I think you can expect to see some moves to ask the alliance to be involved. For example, the maritime patrols and security in the Mediterranean, the Adriatic, the Aegean could be increased. It could be given a new mission of stopping migrant boats instead of just dealing with what they're dealing with now, which is smuggling and WMD proliferation. Also, the troops that you see in the cities of Europe now, more and more. By the way, I saw no increased security at the Rome airport. I've flown 4 times out of there in the last 2 weeks. Nothing since Brussels. You know, again, Italy is just, it's different. But I saw more security in the United States when I was back there 2 weeks ago at their airports. But the troops that you see at the airports, for example, or walking the streets, those are in effect NATO troops because they're dual or triple-hatted. They're performing a national service, but they also have a mission as part of a NATO team somewhere if they were called on. And they probably also have a mission with the European Union in some military aspect, especially the French forces. So we don't have 3 separate armies in this world. We have one, and we have to decide how to divide it up between the different missions they have. And at the moment, in some countries, their mission is domestic security and defense of the cities. Maybe that should be their primary mission, but it's not their only mission. So indirectly, NATO has provided for the training for those people who are helping provide security. I know that's a bit of a stretch, but I'll leave it at that.
Well, it was entirely a fictitious figure, of course, in Crimea, though it makes a very good headline. But bear in fact 3 things. First of all, tourism has collapsed in Crimea. Secondly, they deal with regular power cuts. Thirdly, they deal with an incipient Tatar insurgency movement. And fourthly, they have received absolutely no money from Moscow. None of the money that was promised has actually been received. Now, in the best of all possible worlds, if you were to have a referendum in these circumstances, you would vote to go back. The point is, of course, that perhaps being Russians, they would somehow still think that history is important. But the Russian doctrine, military doctrine, has written into it since 2014 the correction of historical mistakes, one of which was the loss of Crimea, the other of which is the loss of the Baltic states. So we have to make perfectly plain to the Russian minorities in the Baltic states that it is not in their interests ever to go back to the Russian Federation, but they are much better off as Latvian citizens or Lithuanian citizens or Estonian citizens. And we can do this as part of our counter-propaganda campaign, which we've been trying to run since 2015, by telling people what's actually happening in the Crimea. When was the last article you read on the Crimea? What's actually happening in the Crimea? It's incredibly difficult to find this. The only other question I'll mention is on the conventional deterrence. Conventional deterrence is very important because, of course, everything we've said today reminds us of the dramatic fact that the United States as a country lives in the safest strategic environment in the world. And we live in the most dangerous strategic environment in the world. We had General Dunford saying at the beginning of his first press conference as chairman that Russia is the only country that poses an existential threat to the existence of the United States. Well, of course, you could read into this that at some point a deal could well be done in order to reduce that existential threat. And at whose expense will that be? If it's Donald Trump, it will be at Europe's expense. Now, we've been talking about this, I realize, for 70 years, of the possibility of some kind of grand bargain of this kind. But the reality is that I think what you mentioned, the Baltic states at the beginning, I wrote a report, as you know, helped write a report for your institute on Baltic security, in which I think in my paper I made the point that Article 5 is really these days only as credible as Article 3, your ability and your willingness to defend yourself. And if you're not willing to do those things, then I think there will come a time when an American president, it may not be Donald Trump, will have to come to their own deliberations. And it's not going to be some cynical carve-up of the world with Russia, but it will just be a general lack of concern for this part of the world on the grounds that we don't deserve it, quite frankly. We're permanent recidivists, that we're always, just when America thinks it's solved the European problem in 1945 and 1989, we're always going back to our old ways, like nationalism and fascism, and all those other isms that are peculiarly European inventions of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And I think it could come to that pass at some point, and we must make sure that it doesn't.
Well, thank you for that. I think that the debate has really shown that there are no sort of ready-made answers to those questions I posed at the beginning of this seminar. But still, I feel that I'm better informed now, but I also feel that I'm more concerned now. But anyway, please join me in thanking the panelists, the presenters, for these very good presentations. And thank you to the audience for coming and for posing good questions. I would just like to draw the attention to the next seminar in this NATO seminar series, which will take place on the 10th of May. It will be on Nordic security under pressure. It might also be about the Baltic states. So please see the website for further information. And with that, I'll just say thank you for coming and have a great afternoon.